Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we'll be taking a look at the official investigation into the Essex police and their conduct regarding the Rettendon murders. During this video, you'll be hearing statements from many senior detectives who worked on the case, and also those who were close to Darren Nicholls during his time in protected police custody. During this video, you'll hear of many accounts of Darren Nicholls being in contact with an author and journalist before the trial took place. You'll also hear from a member of the drug squad and his previous knowledge of Tucker Tate and Rolfe before these murders were committed. And this is actually the official documentation where it is first mentioned that the Range Rover was found at 6:30 AM and called in by a member of the drug squad. Now, this was later denied and pushed aside as a clerical or admin error, but this is actually the official documentation of where that arises from. Later on in the video, you'll also hear of a potential eyewitness statement existing of someone seeing a VW Passat in Rettendon village. Let's now start with the first statement. Michael Brown retired from Essex Police in 2002. He gives details of his involvement in the Rettendon investigation and his subsequent role as Nicholls' witness protection officer. Because of the importance of his evidence and for the sake of clarity, Brown's statement is reproduced in full. He states, "In early 1996, I undertook a new role as a detective constable working on the major investigation section of the Central Detective Unit at Police Headquarters Chelmsford. Having commenced that role, I was immediately deployed as part of the investigation team for the aforementioned murders. I remember one such operation where I was involved in surveillance upon a subject called Darren Nicholls, who was suspected of drug importation offences. On one particular day, I began work later in the day due to the time of my finish the previous evening. Darren Nicholls had been arrested for the offence that he was suspected of prior to my arrival at work. I remember that I went to a briefing where DC Chris Winston and myself were directed to interview Nicholls in relation to the offences he was under arrest for. I believe that Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley made this decision. At some point, Nicholls asked for DC Wolfgang Bird and was told that he, DC Bird, was also in custody. Later, Nicholls asked to see a senior police officer. I was not present during these two requests, but this is my understanding of the course of events. Detective Superintendent Ralph Barrington, DC Winston and myself then visited Nicholls in a cell where Nicholls said that he had something to say that the police would be extremely interested in and wanted to be interviewed by officers who he could trust. Mr. Barrington assured Nicholls that DC Winston and I could be trusted. Subsequently, DC Winston and I interviewed Nicholls on a number of occasions. These interviews were tape recorded. During those interviews, Nicholls gave his account of what happened upon the night of the triple murder. As a result of that account, Nicholls was arrested for murder. During all of those interviews, a solicitor called Lee Craddock was present to represent Nicholls. In the days that followed, I remember being present at a meeting with Crown Prosecution Service representatives who made the decision that there was not enough evidence to support a charge of murder against Nicholls. Darren Nicholls subsequently agreed to make witness statements about the murders, and he was afforded the status of a protected witness. DC Winston and I took those statements from Nicholls whilst he was still in custody at Rayleigh Police Station for the drugs offences. I cannot remember if Lee Craddock was present or not. DC Winston and I were detailed to be the witness protection officers responsible for Nicholls. Nicholls spent a long period of time housed at a police station custody suite. During that period of time, I visited Nicholls regularly in my role as his witness protection officer. I'd never been specifically trained in the role of witness protection officer and had never previously acted in such a role. Having said that, I considered myself more than capable of working effectively in such a role. I was an extremely experienced officer in terms of my involvement in the investigation of serious crime. Initially, I worked with DC Winston mainly, but he was moved on at some stage and I worked with DC Billy Clark mostly. I would point out that DC Winston was moved on because of tenure, which means that at that time, officers were only permitted to work a certain period of time in one role before they were required to change roles. DC Pat Lee also worked with us, but she was mainly used in relation to the protection of the wife of Nichols. The legal situation regarding Nichols residing at a custody suite at a police station was complicated. My memory is that after he was initially charged with drugs importation offences, he was at some stage bailed. Having been bailed, Nichols voluntarily stayed at the police station for his safety. As I remember, my instructions were that should Nichols try and leave the police station, then I should arrest him for being in breach of his bail conditions. On visiting Nichols, the conversation obviously was not restricted to matters surrounding his protection. Small talk about all kinds of issues was prevalent. From my first meeting with Nichols, I was straight with him and told him the truth. I remember that Nichols used to talk about having money, villas, a nice house and a car when he was eventually free. I knew full well that this would not be the case, and that a protected witness would and should only be given a similar standard of living that he had prior to involvement with the police. Nichols was informed of this in no uncertain terms. He was told that he would only have what he had at the present time. Nichols had fanciful ideas about unlikely schemes such as becoming a helicopter pilot. We used to take Nichols out of the police station regularly for a change of scenery. Sometimes we would take him just for a ride, sometimes for lunch, sometimes to the shops. As Nichols was not technically a prisoner, we used to allow him to walk about the shops as a free person. We would be in the same shop as Nichols or in his general vicinity, but he could view goods without us knowing what he was looking at. I cannot specifically remember taking Nichols to a bookshop. We travelled extensively with Nichols on these days out, as he may have been under threat in Essex and the surrounding areas. While Nichols was with us, he ate McDonald's meals on a regular basis. I never took him to such a restaurant to meet anybody. I also remember taking Nichols to see his people, such as his barrister QC Anne Rafferty. At some stage, Nichols was remanded into custody and served time on remand in prison. Again, my responsibilities included visiting Nichols and producing him from these establishments to police stations for evidence-gathering purposes. I remember on returning Nichols to prison, he was always searched thoroughly by prison staff. Eventually, Nichols was granted bail and he was housed at a secret address under an assumed name. The trial of Michael Steele and Jack Holmes, who had been charged with the 3 murders, took place at the Old Bailey at a later date. During this trial I was to give evidence, and it was thus decided that it would be inappropriate for me to undertake witness protection and escort duties until the conclusion. These roles were undertaken by DC Clark at this time. I am aware of the contents of Nichols' evidence and circumstances being used in a book and a television programme since the trial. The passage of time has possibly clouded my memory, but I will try and piece together the sequence of events which led to me becoming aware of these facts. I remember during Nichols' time in custody prior to him being bailed, he spoke of his inclination to write a book and make some money to assist with his and his family's relocation. My memory of my reaction was that I would have advised him that he was unwise to do so. Public airing of such a story could only increase his chances of being identified in any later change of identity or relocation. Having said that, I did not take Nichols' idea too seriously. I really thought he was shooting the breeze at this stage. I'm not sure at this stage whether I mentioned these issues to the senior investigating officer, although of course I would regularly be involved in giving him a detailed briefing of how Nichols was coping. I believe that after Nichols was bailed, I first found out for certain that a book was being published, or had been published. I really cannot give an estimation of the date or where this occurred in the sequence of events. It's fair to say I was livid, and told Nichols so. At about the same time I found out that Nichols had done some filming. Again, I was livid and let Nichols know my thoughts. My reasons for the anger were mainly because I believed that Nichols was putting his own security in jeopardy. This, obviously in my opinion, placed those who had contact with Nichols at an increased risk, which included my colleagues and I. I am sure I would have mentioned this initial knowledge to the senior investigating officer, but again I do not remember the specifics. I remember at some stage Detective Superintendent Brian Story, Detective Sergeant Wyatt, DC Clark and I went to a television studio to view the proposed programme about Nichols. We raised our objections to the programme as it was felt that aspects threatened the security of Nichols. In relation to the author of the book about Nichols, Tony Thompson, we have never met as far as I know. I believe that Thompson visited Nichols once or twice, whilst Nichols was resident at Harlow Police Station. I was not aware of the visit at the time and only became aware of this when the book came out. I have been shown a custody record dated the 9th of March 1997. This record is an entry at 10:10 indicating the beginning of a visit from Tony Thompson to Nichols. At 10:55 hours an entry signifies my visit, and at 12:07 hours an entry signifies the end of the visit by Thompson. The latter two described entries I recognise as being my writing. I cannot remember the visits written about. Also, I do not remember any black men visiting Nichols. In fact, I do not remember any of his visitors. I would point out that whilst he was a resident at Harlow Police Station, Nichols himself decided who his visitors were to be. As far as I remember, there were no formal rules about visitors to Nichols at the time of his residence or custody at the police stations. It was believed that Nichols was highly unlikely to invite a person who would cause him harm, thus no vetting or verifying the identity of his visitors at the police station took place. Nichols was allowed to make telephone calls in private and write and send letters. As far as I remember, there were no rules in general for how to monitor visits to protected witnesses. I have no knowledge of Nichols recording his own video diaries whilst either in or out of custody. In relation to Francis Reid, I can only say what Nichols told me in interview. I had no dealings with Reid at all. Had I have been aware or suspected that Nichols had been lying about Reid's involvement, then Nichols would have been challenged and encouraged to have told the truth. Any grounds that I had to believe that Nichols may have been lying would have been reported to the senior investigating officer. I had no grounds for believing that Nichols told me lies in relation to Reid. As far as I remember, there were no formal rules in those days about contact by protected witnesses with the media, authors or journalists. If Nichols had made me aware that he was definitely in the process of arranging the making of a book, television programme or film, I would have quite clearly forbidden him from doing so and indicated that he may be putting his position on the witness protection scheme in jeopardy. As soon as I was aware of such a serious intent to sell his story, I would have told the senior investigating officer. I was not aware of the seriousness of Nichols' intention until it was too late. The inquiry team were obviously aware at some stage what had happened, as I have previously mentioned in relation to members attending the viewing of the proposed television programme. Nichols never discussed with me what he received for selling the story. Once Nichols began to tell us what he had witnessed in relation to the 3 murders, as far as I can remember, his story was consistent. I have never read the book or watched the television programme, so cannot comment upon their contents. In relation to allegations that the police may have given Nichols a script, this is simply not true. The sound of papers rustling in interviews is merely the notes of officers. There were occasions where, for example, Nichols was confused about directions he had taken. I had a good knowledge of the area and pointed out the impossibility of certain routes. These issues were covered during my cross-examination at court. The allegation that the police suggested to Nichols that he should admit more serious offences than he had actually committed are false and contemptible. The same applies to any suggestion that the police suggested in any way that Nichols should lie. As far as I know, everything I have said in this statement is true. Nichols was never given any comforts or inducements influencing him to tell anything but the truth. I am certainly not party to any conspiracy to pervert the course of justice with Nichols or anybody else. I am extremely proud of being involved in this piece of police work and the subsequent conviction of those responsible for the murders. DC William Clark. DC Clark was employed by Essex Police as a detective constable until his retirement in 2001. He took over Nichols' witness protection duties when DC Winston moved on to other duties. He states, quote, "I would like to confirm that I have no knowledge of any information whatsoever that would suggest that Nichols or any of the officers who initially dealt with him told lies in his statements or during his later testimony in court. Suggestions that the police connived with Nichols in creating a false story are ridiculous, and he was never encouraged to admit offences he had never committed. Nichols was only encouraged to tell the complete and utter truth. I have no knowledge of suggestions that Nichols was encouraged to admit drugs offences of a more serious nature than he had actually committed. Also, the same applies to suggestions that he was encouraged to falsify evidence about a gun. In relation to his witness protection duties, he worked almost exclusively with DC Michael Brown, but very occasionally DC Pat Lee or DC Paul Keeble would assist them. In relation to visitors to Nichols, he states, quote, Nichols was allowed to have visitors, which generally DC Brown and myself would facilitate. Nichols never had many visits, and we used to go along with Nichols' request to be visited by individuals. As far as vetting of those visitors goes, as far as I remember, we never had any reason to prohibit any visitors. We never had a rigid system for vetting and trusted that Nichols would never invite anyone who would cause him harm. I cannot remember ever checking the identification of any visitors, but it was obviously a long time ago. I remember the following visitors to Nichols at Harlow: his wife Rachel, although I cannot be sure she did visit, his mother, his brother, possibly Rachel's sister, his solicitor, his barrister, Ricky, a kitchen maker from Braintree, and a black man called Thompson. Darren said that Thompson was his friend, I believe, or possibly a friend of his brother's, or even possibly another member of his family. I do vaguely recall one visit by Thompson which I believe was in the interview room as opposed to the cell. Darren certainly never said that Thompson was writing a book, and I had no idea at this time that Thompson was a journalist or book author. Had I known that Thompson was an author, I would have prevented the visit. Of course, the full facts would have also been passed on to the senior investigating officer as well. He confirms that, quote, I do not recall specifically taking Nichols to a bookshop, but would not rule it out. Nichols was definitely never taken by myself to McDonald's in Romford to meet Thompson. In relation to Nichols' time within the prison system, he states, after some time, Nichols was moved from Harlow Police Station to the prison system. Initially, Nichols went to HMP blanked out Alpha and then HMP blanked out Beta. I had no idea that Nichols was visited by Thompson while he was in prison. As far as I was aware, Nichols never received any visitors whilst he was at HMP blanked out Beta blanked out. I never had any request from Nichols that Thompson should visit him in prison, and certainly never told the prison authorities that he could. Nichols was eventually bailed to live with his wife for some months prior to the trial, during which he was taken back into custody at a police station. During the trial, I alone looked after Nichols, as DC Brown and DC Winston were excluded from seeing him on advice from counsel. I certainly never discussed Nichols' evidence with him during the period he was giving that evidence to the court. In relation to the book and television programme, it was certainly fair to say that Darren is talkative. I spent many hours with Darren and he would talk about many of his dreams, most of which were impossible. Darren talked of becoming an airline or a helicopter pilot. Nichols had the effect of making me not take too seriously what he said on occasions. I do remember at some stage Darren told me about going to Hollywood in relation to the things that had happened to him. I laughed. I think Darren told me that he was going to write a book as well. I cannot remember when these subjects were first raised by Darren, but I did not take him seriously. I remember at some later stage I saw Darren in a lay-by burger van, where I gave him a telling off for not having told us about the fact he was to appear in a television programme. It may have been this same meeting, I cannot be sure, but Darren told me that there was going to be a book written about him called Blogs. I'm not 100% sure whether this meeting was before or after the trial, but my initial thought was that it was after the trial. At some stage I must have mentioned this to the senior investigating officer, but again I cannot remember doing so. I have no memories of discussing with Darren at any stage about the contracts he may have entered into and what monies he was set to have made from his story. At some stage around this time, I and others from Essex Police visited a television company where I watched Darren appearing in a film about himself. Darren was wearing clothing that he always wore, and in my opinion his face was clearly recognisable. The concerns of Essex Police were raised to the television company representatives who were present. I have no memories of Darren making video diaries about himself in connection with this production, and indeed have no memory of him being in possession of a camcorder of any description at any time. I was certainly aware of the disclosure principles that were in place at the time, and would have made the instant office aware if I had seriously believed that Nichols had made any contact with any member of the press, a journalist, an author, or media representative. Detective Constable Patricia Lee. Patricia Lee is a detective constable with Essex Police. Her responsibilities were primarily to work with Nichols' wife Rachel. She worked mainly with DC Paul Keeble, but occasionally she would also work with Darren when his witness protection officers needed time off. She states, I never had anything to do with the interviewing of Darren Nichols or indeed the taking of any statements from him. Indeed, I never discussed the contents of Darren's evidence with him on the occasions that I met him. I do seem to recall Rachel's sister visiting Darren on one occasion. Apart from that, I never had anything to do with the visitors to Darren whilst he was in custody. I have no mention of a visitor to Darren called Tony Thompson, or indeed any visitors who are black in colour. In relation to the media, she states, "The first memory I have of any mention of the press, media or a journalist being involved with Darren is when DC Clark and DC Brown told me that a television programme had been made about Darren. I was told that Essex Police were going to try to prevent the programme being shown. I was shocked that he and Rachel were putting themselves in jeopardy. Rachel had never said anything to me about the making of the television programme. This all came to my attention after the trial of the offenders. The only mention I had ever heard about the press was when Darren had talked about going to the press or refusing to give his evidence. These comments were made over financial issues, and as far as I remember, those issues were resolved amicably." She also confirms, "I have no knowledge at all of any mention of Darren's evidence being concocted in any way, shape or form. Rachel Nichols and Darren Nichols never gave me any indication at all that any part of Darren evidence was in any way false. I cannot see any motive or incentive for Darren giving false evidence. He and Rachel ended up living the same lifestyle they had previously been accustomed to." Detective Constable Paul Keeble. Paul Keeble is a detective constable in Essex Police. In relation to Nichols, he states, "Because of my responsibilities towards another witness, my contact with Darren Nichols was kept to an absolute minimum. In fact, I am reasonably certain that I did not meet Darren Nichols until after the convictions of Jack Wombs and Michael Steele. I vaguely remember meeting Darren Nichols at a police station for a very brief period of time. I was with DC Michael Brown and Detective Superintendent Bright, who needed to discuss issues unknown to me with Nichols. I do not know how the rules were set in relation to who was allowed to visit Nichols and how these visitors were vetted. I also had no idea that Nichols had contact with any members of the press, media or any journalists until I remember officers attending a meeting at a television company just prior to a proposed programme about Nichols. I have certainly no knowledge or have never heard anything to suggest that Nichols fabricated any of his evidence in any way, shape or form." Senior officers. Brian Story. Because of the importance of Brian Story's role within the murder investigation, his statement is shown in full. "I was previously employed by Essex Police as a police officer. In December 1995, I was a Detective Chief Inspector when I attended the scene of the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe. I attended the post-mortems of the victims the following day, but because of my other commitments, I did not remain on the inquiry at that stage. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley was appointed as Senior Investigating Officer to lead the investigation team. On March 11, 1996, I became the Senior Investigating Officer in the case of the murders, and remained in that position until after the latter convictions of Michael Steele and Jack Wombs. Upon my appointment, the retiring Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley fully briefed me on the state of the investigation. I was promoted on the 1st of April 1996 to Detective Superintendent. In May 1996, 3 individuals were arrested for these murders. The people arrested were Darren Nichols, Michael Steele and Jack Wombs, all of whom had been suspects from early on in the inquiry. The trio and others were also in custody whilst under arrest for drugs importation offences. To complicate matters further, a police officer by the name of DC Wolfgang Bird was also in police custody at the same time for various offences, some of which were connected to the drugs offences, although I had no involvement whatsoever in this investigation. I became aware at an early stage in his arrest, Mr. Nichols wished to speak to a senior police officer and indicated that he wanted to give an account to the police. Subsequently, following this account, Mr. Nichols was charged with drug offences, and after consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service, he was used as a prosecution witness in the murder case. I cannot now remember why Darren Nichols changed his solicitor while in the process of being interviewed. I recall that Darren Nichols was given the option of a number of solicitors, but I cannot remember the sequence of solicitors he used or Lee Craddock's involvement. I certainly have no knowledge of anything at all that would support the allegations that papers were passed to Darren Nichols during police interviews, that he was encouraged to admit to more serious drug offences that he had not actually committed, and that he was asked to change the dates in his account of when he purchased a gun. I've been asked if I can comment upon allegations that during interview, statement making and through to giving evidence, Darren Nichols covered up for Francis Reid and his alleged guilty participation in drugs importation. I do not remember the finer points of what Darren Nichols said about Francis Reid, and I cannot remember how he dealt with Mr. Reid. Again, though, I have no knowledge of anything that would suggest that Darren was dishonest in his account. Darren Nichols, his wife and children were subsequently cared for under the Witness Protection Scheme. Having been interviewed by DC Chris Winston and DC Michael Brown, the pair were initially chosen to be the officers responsible for the protection of Mr. Nichols. I cannot remember exactly why the pair were chosen. I believe that their choice was based upon the good rapport they had built with Mr. Nichols, or the fact they may have attended training courses in witness protection. Initially, Detective Superintendent David Bright and then Detective Superintendent Michael Payne were responsible for the day-to-day supervision of those engaged in the witness protection role. I am aware that DC Winston was later replaced as a witness protection officer by DC Bill Clark. I personally had never received any formal training in relation to witness protection. It is fair to say that evidence existed in relation to the cell sighting of the mobile telephones that belonged to Mr. Nichols, Mr. Steele and Mr. Wombs. This evidence was part of a massive amount of work that a separate intelligence cell had put together. As far as I know, DC Winston and DC Brown and DC Clark would have not had an extensive knowledge of this evidence. Information uncovered during the inquiry was not shared amongst others who did not need to know. The idea was to minimise any risk of leaks from within the organisation that would alert any suspects to our interest and the fact they may be arrested and interviewed at a later date. In my role as Senior Investigating Officer, I saw it as my responsibility to visit Mr. Nichols on occasions to update him on the state of the investigation, obviously in general terms without discussing individuals' evidence. During those visits at some stage I remember that Darren Nichols told me that he was thinking of writing a book about his experiences. I do not remember when this was, but I formed the opinion that Darren Nichols was purely talking about his future plans. I had no idea or reason to know that he was making active steps to arrange the sale of his story to the media before the trial of Michael Steele and Jack Wombs had taken place. I had no knowledge that Darren Nichols was visited whilst in police and prison custody by a journalist and book author called Tony Thompson. This has only come to my attention as a result of being informed by D.I. Phantom and D.C. Powell. I would not have known in 1996 and up until the trial who Tony Thompson was, and I had no idea that his name was recorded on Darren Nichols' police custody record as a visitor. Custody records were kept in relation to Darren Nichols being kept in police cells, and these records should have shown the details of any visitors he had. I have been informed that Tony Thompson is shown on those records as visiting on 5 occasions. I believe that I remember the custody records were checked periodically by myself or my staff. Had I have seen this name, I feel sure that I would have asked the witness protection officers exactly who he was. I would have been interested to know the details of any visitors to Darren Nichols, but I cannot remember anything about the name Tony Thompson. It is possible that I did become aware of a visitor called Tony Thompson, and that I was given an innocent explanation as to who he was, but I cannot recall this now. I do not remember being involved in discussions about how visitors were to be vetted. In relation to Darren Nichols being in custody at the police stations, it should be borne in mind that he was technically on bail for part of the time with the condition that he resided where I decreed, which of course was the police cells. Therefore, Darren Nichols' rights had to be carefully considered in relation to things such as telephone calls, visitors, food, money, exercise and other mundane matters. As I remember, the thinking adopted was that Darren Nichols would be given similar rights to those enjoyed by a person who was serving time on remand in prison awaiting trial. Darren Nichols most certainly would not have been allowed a video camera in police cells, and I have no memory of him being found with one. Any telephone calls that Darren made should have been supervised by police, but I cannot say if this actually happened. I seem to remember that there were issues surrounding Darren Nichols seeking an injunction about a television programme. This would have been my first knowledge that Darren Nichols had in fact gone to the media, but it was long after the trial. By now I was promoted to Chief Superintendent and I was working elsewhere. I do not believe that I was even consulted about the issues surrounding the injunction and the television programme. I retired on the 8th of November 1999, and it was not until after this date I became aware that Darren Nichols' story was now published in book form. I never read the book. My memories of the inquiry are clouded in places due to the passage of time. I would say that if there had been any suggestion of any acts of dishonesty or inappropriate conduct by police officers engaged on the inquiry, then I would have taken the appropriate action. I have no memories of any such suggestions in relation to how Darren Nichols was dealt with, and feel sure I would still remember any such indication that would have come to my attention. Of course, I was fully aware at the time that any press or media involvement or contact with Darren Nichols would be of interest to the defence team of those standing trial. Had I been aware of any such involvement or contact, then I would have ensured that the circumstances were investigated and that the information was disclosed to the Crown Prosecution Service. I would also have been very mindful as to any possible resulting security implications for Darren Nichols and anybody connected with him. David Bright. David Bright retired from Essex Police in December 1999. He states between 1992 and 1994, I was a senior investigating officer. From initial covert inquiries made, it was clear there were areas of considerable unrest concerning criminality involving DC Wolfgang Bird and Nichols, as well as other serving officers. Following on from my original inquiries, a full-scale investigation was embarked upon, codenamed Operation Apache. This operation, which I headed as a senior investigating officer at its height, had 35 officers seconded to it and ran for a period of 4 years from 1996 to 1999. It was and still remains the biggest internal investigation ever undertaken by Essex Police. Aside from being in direct command of Operation Apache, I was also required to carry on in total with my role as a divisional commander, dealing with all aspects that the role demanded, one of which involved overseeing the witness protection programme, which at this time included the protection of Darren Nichols, his wife and children. This situation came into being following on from Nichols having been arrested and subsequently making admissions with regards to his involvement in the murders of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. Also arrested and charged in connection with these murders were Michael Steele and Jack Wombs. Throughout the time that Nichols was remanded within the prison system or whilst on bail and residing at police premises, I did not see him on a daily basis as it were, but at regular intervals I would visit him. At times his wife and family were present, and at other times he was alone. The day-to-day minding of Nichols was undertaken by officers from my division who were attached to the Witness Protection Unit. The officers concerned had been selected by myself for this specialised and demanding role. All were proven detectives with good people skills who were discreet, reliable and with an abundance of common sense. All essential attributes for the duty role they were required to perform. Aside from general welfare issues, another reason for visiting with Nichols would be for him to officially be told by myself as to the reasons why frequent requests and demands for a whole range of benefits and treats involved the use of 4 vulnerable witnesses, all of whom were afforded protected witness status, to ensure the continued safety and well-being of the individuals concerned, whilst complying with all the legal rules governing the use of such witnesses. I brought into being and was responsible for running the then new concept for Essex Police, that of a formalised witness protection programme. On the 1st of October 1995, I was promoted to the rank of Detective Superintendent and appointed as Commander of Crime Operations Division. My division was divided into a number of specialised departments, namely Major Investigation, Special Branch, Surveillance, Child Protection, Drug Squad, Fraud Squad, Motor Vehicle Crime, Witness Protection and Covert Operations. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of December 1995, this being the first day of a period of annual leave for myself, which was to be taken out of the country, I was at my home address when I received a telephone call from a then-serving detective constable working on the drug squad. He informed me that 3 men had been found shot dead in a Range Rover motor vehicle at an isolated location in Rettendon, Essex. It was a gangland-style killing. 2 of the deceased were immediately identified as Patrick Tate and Tony Tucker, and in due course the 3rd man was found out to be Craig Rolfe. All of these men were known to me and were known players in major drug-dealing circles operating throughout Essex and the south-east of England. I instructed the caller to make telephone contact with all officers under my command, who were serving on the Major Investigation Section and the Drug Squad, and for all of them to report to the senior officer at the murder scene. Although I did not take part in the investigation into the deaths of Tucker Tate and Rolfe, the officers from my division who were allocated to the investigation from the outset remained working on the inquiry until its eventual conclusion. I've been asked if I am aware of the fact that whilst in police protected custody, Darren Nichols sold his story to a journalist. I had no idea at the time leading up to the Central Criminal Court trial involving himself, Steele and Wombs, that he, Nichols, was engaged in meeting with a journalist. Furthermore, I have no knowledge whatsoever that he was recording video diaries in this same period of time. Similarly, I had no information whether the officers responsible for the day-to-day caring for Nichols were aware of such activity taking place, but I am certain that if they had known of such goings-on, they would have informed me of the situation, and had I been so notified, I would have instigated a full investigation into the circumstances without any delay, and would have further made sure that the facts would have been brought to the attention of the chief officers and also disclosed to the Crown Prosecution Service and prosecuting barristers for the Crown. Had any such activity been embarked upon by Nichols as suggested, I would have had two serious areas of concern, namely that damage could be done to the forthcoming trial involving himself and his co-accused, and such a situation would clearly have been a cause of considerable concern with regards to the day-to-day security of Nichols and his family. I first became aware that Nichols had sold or told his story when I saw a television promo advertising a forthcoming documentary programme about Nichols. I also read a book entitled Blogs 19 written by Tony Thompson, which is allegedly Nichols' recollection of his involvement with Michael Steele and Jack Wombs and his time spent with Essex Police. I'm unsure now whether I read the book before viewing the television programme or I bought the book after watching the documentary. I've also been informed that certain allegations have been made that Nichols was dishonest in his evidence and that he connived with police to tell lies. I've absolutely no knowledge of any information which would give these theories any credence whatsoever. The witness protection officers involved with Nichols were, as previously stated, selected due to their reputation for high integrity and dedication. I simply cannot believe that they would have been foolish enough to become involved in such a course of action. Furthermore, during the times that I spent with Nichols, he never gave me any indication that he sold his story to anyone. There was also no evidence that came to my attention during the Operation Apache investigation that suggested Nichols conspired with anyone to lie about the Rettendon murders. As far as Nichols was concerned, it was felt that he would not be foolish enough to invite a visitor who may do him harm. What also should be borne in mind is that whilst he was lodged at some of the police stations within Essex, and in particular Harlow Police Station, he was technically on bail subject to a condition of residence determined by the police, where he was to reside, and as such in theory, he could speak to whoever he chose, subject to not breaking any bail condition imposed by the court. Whilst Nichols was in police protective custody, as per my instructions, the protection officers always took a common sense approach in deciding who would be allowed to visit or communicate with Nichols. Ralph Barrington. At the time of the Rettendon investigation, Mr. Barrington was a Detective Chief Superintendent with Essex Police. His position at that time was head of their Criminal Investigation Department. He retired from Essex Police in June 1997 and since then has been employed as an investigations advisor by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. He states, "I've been asked if I have any recollection of the witness Darren Nichols having contact with a journalist named Tony Thompson, or indeed any other members of the media prior to him giving evidence at the trial of Steele and Wombs." My answer is that I have no such recollection. I was aware that Darren Nichols' credibility would be an issue when he gave evidence, and that anything affecting his credibility would have been a matter of concern. For this reason, I am confident that had I been aware of any involvement between Darren Nichols and a journalist, I would have had the matter investigated and the outcome would have been disclosed to the Crown Prosecution Service. At the time, I worked very closely with Geoffrey Markham, Assistant Chief Constable responsible for police operations, and had there been any suggestion of Nichols' involvement with the media, I would have brought this to his attention. In relation to Nichols' evidence, Mr. Barrington states the following. I have also been asked whether I have any comment to make on the suggestion that the evidence given by Nichols did not come from his own knowledge of the murders, but that he relayed facts provided to him by the police. I would like to make the following comments. Nichols provided a detailed account that included facts which were completely unknown to the police, some of which we were able to corroborate. Nichols was interviewed on tape, and his first account of his involvement in the murders and what he could say about Steele and Wombs was recorded. I believe that Nichols started to give his account fairly soon after his meeting with me on the 14th of May 1996. Even if members of Essex Police had the requisite criminal intent and had known facts that they could not have known prior to receiving Nichols' account, it is difficult to see how Nichols could have been given this information by the police prior to him giving his own account on tape. For the record, I can confirm that at no time was there any suggestion of Nichols' account being anything other than his own. I've been asked if I have any recall of the name Francis Reid. I have no such recollection. I've been informed that Nichols stated during his evidence that Reid accompanied him on a trip to the continent where controlled drugs were subsequently purchased and imported to England. Apparently this trip occurred before the Rettendon murders, and Nichols is saying that during that trip Reid never had any knowledge of the drugs issues, or at least that he never made Reid aware. I've been told that the police attempted to speak to Reid as a witness and that he refused. I have no recollection of taking part in any conversation leading to the decision to deal with Reid in such a manner. If I were involved in such a conversation, then I would have ensured an entry was made in the police file. I have been informed that there is no such entry. Given the circumstances as explained to me in relation to Reid, had I been aware at the time of the investigation, then I believe I would have more than likely been in favour of arresting Reid and interviewing him after he had been cautioned. Having said that, the circumstances given to me are brief, and any such decision would have been made after deep consultation with other senior officers involved in the inquiry. Ivan Dibley. Despite a number of requests, retired Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley has refused to be interviewed by members of the investigation team. Detective Sergeant Brian White. Brian White is employed by Essex Police as a detective sergeant. Because of his in-depth knowledge of the Rettendon investigation and the importance of his evidence, his statement is shown almost in its entirety. In December 1995, Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe were murdered in Rettendon. At the time, I was working as a detective sergeant on Central Detective Unit Major Investigation Section at Police Headquarters, Chelmsford. I became aware of these murders on the day the bodies were discovered, and I was placed on the investigation team the very same day. Other officers from the Central Detective Unit Drug Squad and Crime Operations also joined the inquiry on the same day. Initially, I worked in Holmes' Instant Room performing the roles of receiver and action allocator. At some later time during the course of the investigation, I was given the task of supervising an intelligence cell, and later still I became office manager. A separate telephone intelligence unit ran alongside the inquiry. This was staffed by other officers under the supervision of Detective Sergeant Robin Wyatt. During the course of the inquiry, intelligence emerged indicating that Steele, Wombs and Nichols were engaged in the importation of controlled drugs into the UK. This led to a joint investigation by police and HM Customs and Excise and culminated in the arrest of Darren Nichols in possession of around 10 kilos of cannabis resin. Following this arrest, I recall that Steele, Wombs were arrested on the same day and that a number of other subjects were all arrested later. All three were interviewed, and after initially making no comment, Nichols asked to see a senior police officer. I recall that he was seen by the head of CID at the time, Detective Chief Superintendent Ralph Barrington. During further interviews, Nichols gave an account of his knowledge of the murders to the interviewing officers, DC Chris Winston and DC Michael Brown. It's fair to say that Nichols' account of the night in question gave me great satisfaction, as I knew that the information was corroborated by other evidence within the incident room. The account given by Nichols was detailed and comprehensive, and was corroborated by cell site analysis of the mobile telephones used by himself, Steele and Wombs at the time of the murders. I was excited by the prospect I was to learn from Nichols' account exactly how all the parties made their way to the scene of the murders and how the offenders had been able to effect these murders. Indeed, Nichols' account led officers to make further inquiries. During the inquiries, a further witness was identified placing Nichols in a vehicle near to the scene. The vehicle itself, a Volkswagen Passat, was recovered and a witness identified who linked Steele to the vehicle. I have been made aware that allegations have been made that the account given by Nichols was not the truth and that he had concocted the story with his interviewers. These allegations are totally untrue and would have been impossible to carry out. Nichols provided information during his interviews which provided fresh lines of inquiry which until then were unknown to police. As far as I am concerned, Nichols' account was credible and was corroborated by other evidence in police possession. I did not see him give evidence, but I know that he was the subject of the most rigorous and detailed cross-examination by all defence counsel for a number of weeks. I did not have any direct dealings with Nichols when he was arrested, interviewed and gave statements, although I did meet him at the Central Criminal Court prior to him giving evidence, and I believe I may have seen him whilst he was in custody at a police station, although I am not certain of this. His interviewing officers, Detective Constables Winston and Brown, would have not had an intimate knowledge of the finer points of the intelligence gained from the cell site analysis, and therefore would have been unable to concoct a story to fit that intelligence. There were 3 distinct investigative departments within the team: the Incident Office staff making general inquiries, the Intelligence Cell and Telephone Unit. Potentially sensitive intelligence and evidence would not be shared amongst the departments unless necessary. I recall that during the investigation I made a radio broadcast appealing for witnesses to come forward in confidence. I tried to make the public aware of the way the investigation was being conducted, and that information would only be shared amongst those police officers who had a justifiable need to know. I had no idea that Darren Nichols had sold or told his story to a journalist, author or any member of the media until I went to a court hearing where the defence team of Wombs and Steele was seeking access to an unedited version of a television programme about Nichols. This was certainly after the convictions of Steele and Wombs. I have never heard of an author called Tony Thompson until a book about Nichols was published. I have never read this book. Had I been aware that Nichols was in contact with any potential author or member of the media before the murder trial, then I would have ensured that this information would have been reported to a senior officer and disclosed to the Crown Prosecution Service. Detective Sergeant Robin Wyatt. Robin Wyatt is a detective sergeant employed by the Essex Police. Again, due to his in-depth knowledge of the Rettendon investigation, his statement is shown in its entirety. In December 1995, I was a detective sergeant on the Essex Police Drug Squad. At that time, the drug squad were engaged in the preparatory stages of an operation into the alleged drug dealing activities of 3 men called Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. Through my involvement in this operation, I knew the 3 suspects by sight, and in early December 1995, I had seen the suspect Craig Rolfe using a particular Range Rover. On the morning of the 6th of December 1995, I became aware of an incident where 3 men had been found shot dead in a Range Rover at Rettendon, Essex. When I established the registration of the vehicle, I realised it was the same vehicle I had seen Craig Rolfe using a few days earlier. As a result, I contacted a senior investigating officer at the time, DCI Brian Story, and was requested to attend the scene. Later the same morning, I made a positive identification of the 3 victims as Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. In view of the current operation being conducted by the drug squad, a decision was made to use the officers involved on the murder investigation team. I was initially made responsible for setting up an intelligence unit within the Holmes Incident Room with specific responsibility for gathering and developing intelligence in respect of telephone usage, including cell site analysis. The activity of the intelligence unit was directed by the intelligence/evidence being received/developed by the main Holmes Incident Room. The intelligence picture obtained in respect of relevant telephones was provided to the management team for the incident, but was not generally circulated unless necessary. I'm aware at an early stage the defendant Michael Steele was made a main suspect for the investigation. At some time during the investigation, I moved from the intelligence unit and performed the role of office manager within the main Holmes Incident Room. In this role, I was fully aware and involved in all matters relating to the ongoing investigation. I have a good recollection of the activity which led to the arrest of Michael Steele, Jack Wombs, Darren Nichols and others in May 1996. The arrests were the culmination of a proactive joint investigation with HM Customs and Excise into the ongoing drug trafficking activities of Michael Steele and his associates. The arrest of Darren Nichols in possession of 10 kilos of cannabis received from Michael Steele acted as the catalyst for the arrest of all persons identified as involved in the importations. At the time of the arrest, Michael Steele, Jack Womes and Darren Nichols were also suspected of involvement in the 3 murders in December 1995. Michael Steele had been identified as the person the 3 victims had been scheduled to meet at the time of their deaths, and Jack Womes and Darren Nichols had been linked to the scene of the murders at the relevant time through cell site analysis. I am aware that at the time of his arrest, Darren Nichols was subject of a separate investigation that was investigating the alleged corrupt activity of 2 serving Essex police officers. Part of this investigation concerned the alleged corrupt relationship between one of the officers and Darren Nichols, who at that time was a registered informant. I am aware that when interviewed, Darren Nichols initially made no comment to all questions in relation to the alleged importation and drugs offences. I am also aware that later on the day of his arrest, he made a request to speak to a senior officer. He was subsequently seen by Detective Chief Superintendent Barrington, and as a result of this meeting made a request to be further interviewed. I have a clear recollection of waiting with the senior management team for the investigation whilst the interview with Darren Nichols took place. I can recall the subsequent briefing provided to the management team by the interviewing officers. I can recall the initial account of events that had been put forward by Darren Nichols in respect of the 3 murders, and I can remember the elation of the investigation team. I have been informed that allegations of collusion between Darren Nichols and the interviewing officers have been made. In my opinion, this allegation is ridiculous, as at the time of the initial interviews, the investigation team did not know how the murders had been committed, and the interviewing officers would not have known the detailed intelligence picture from the cell site analysis. In my view, the first account provided by Darren Nichols was fully supported by the intelligence available at the time. Further to this, inquiries made as a result of Darren Nichols' interview revealed further independent corroboration of his version of events, i.e. the confirmed sighting of a vehicle similar in detail to the one being used by Nichols in the side road in Ressendon Village at the relevant time, and the recovery of the VW Passat motor car used. This evidence was unknown to the investigation team prior to the arrest and interview and completely undermines the allegation of collusion between Nichols and the investigation team. After the arrest had taken place, the murder incident room was reduced in size, and myself and another detective sergeant, Brian White, were responsible for the preparation of the case file and producing the relevant unused material schedules. DS Brian White and I were also present throughout the subsequent trial at the Central Criminal Court that commenced in September 1997. I was present when Darren Nichols was called as a witness and observed his reaction to an extremely robust attack on his evidence and credibility by 2 senior Queen's Counsel representing Michael Steele and Jack Womes. In total, Nichols was present in the